Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the various Jewish sects, the various sectarian beliefs of the Jewish people in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. The two most known to most Christians, sects that were had in that day, were between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and these can actually be seen in contrast one to another. With the Pharisees, the term means the separated ones, and indeed they viewed themselves as having been spiritually separated, trying to observe the law, trying to be a cut above the normal population. The term Sadduq from Sadducees refers to the righteous ones. Now, it might be that they were referring to themselves as the righteous ones because they were keeping the law and they viewed themselves as engaged in the temple, or it might be that the term itself, the title itself, comes from Zadok, who was the priest and priestly family that had been appointed by David. Remember, all priests were descendants of Aaron, but one particular family of the line of Aaron was appointed by David and Solomon to be the high priest, and so it might be because the Sadducees were affiliated with the temple. In the case of the Pharisees, they held the authority of the entire Old Testament as well as the oral law, which had not been yet written. That's why it was oral. It eventually would be written and preserved in writings like the Mishnah and then later on in the Talmud. The Sadducees viewed the Torah as having the great authority, that is, the first 5 books of Moses, and then the other books, you could sort of take them or leave them. They still thought they were valuable, but not having the same level of authority. The Pharisees believed in miracles and angels and immortality. The Sadducees rejected those same things. They didn't think miracles were for today, or that angels were around today, or that, or possibly at any time, but especially today. And the Sadducees believed that when you're dead, and that's the end of the story. The Pharisees believed in a future resurrection. The Sadducees did not. They denied any life after death. That when the body dies, so the inner part of the person dies as well. The Pharisees were very popular in the synagogues. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody in the synagogue was a Pharisee, but they had a great amount of popularity. They were respected in the synagogues. The Sadducees had influence in the temple. They ruled in the temple. Now, first century Judaism had both Sadducees and Pharisees. Two other sects which we can talk about are the Essenes and the Zealots, but it should be pointed out that most people did not fall into any of these 4 categories. These were perhaps, we could think of them as all minority groups that influenced first century Judaism, but first century Judaism was not part of any one of these 4 groups entirely. And so you had Sadducees, you had Pharisees, you had not very many Essenes, you had some Zealots, and then most people were none of the above, were perhaps influenced by 1 or 2 of these, but they didn't actually belong to any of these specific groups. If we were to put the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes in sort of a continuum, we would see that the Sadducees held to free will. The Pharisees felt that God ordains, but man also makes real decisions. The Essenes, on the other hand, held to almost sort of a fatalism that God does what He will, and it almost doesn't matter what you do. Not that you do anything you want, but that God's will is going to be carried out in spite of you. The Sadducees held, we already said, there was no life after the death. The Pharisees believed in a future resurrection and a final judgment. And the Essenes likewise mirrored those same ideas of the Pharisees. They held to the immortality of the soul. And so the Sadducees, in this case, were alone in having this idea that there was no life after death. Josephus talks about these various sects. He says, for there are 3 philosophical sects among the Jews, the followers of the first, which are the Pharisees, of the second, Sadducees, the third sect, which pretends to be a severe discipline, are called the Essenes. And these last are Jews by birth and seem to have a greater affection for each other than the other sects have. That is, the Essenes were commonly bonded into sort of a unity that far outshone that of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. After all, within the Essenes, you actually had groups that would have communal living. They would live together. The Sadducees and Pharisees didn't do that sort of thing. They had their own homes. But the Essenes were communal, at least a great many of them were. Now, the term Essenes comes from the Hebrew word asa. Those means to do or to make. And so the Essenes, you could call them those who do. They are reputed to have been a splinter group from the Sadducees. And you say, well, how can that be? They've got very different ideas. Well, they had different ideas. And they talked about, and I've only spoken about some of them, with regards to worship in the temple. They had some very, very different ideas. They felt that the Sadducees had been corrupted, and that the temple worship and some of the things that were being done in the temple, and even the priesthood, in fact, they made reference to the wicked priest. And they're probably talking about some of the Hasmonean priests that had moved themselves into the position of the high priest. A great many of the Essenes held to celibacy. Not all of them, but it was a common motif, very rare among the Jews. And so in this sense, the Essenes were actually sort of a rarity, in that they held, a great many of them held to celibacy. They renounced all personal possessions, both those that lived in towns and communities. And in the case of the Essene community at Qumran, that's a group that had left all of these surrounding towns and gone out to live a very exclusive life by themselves, a solitary life. They renounced all personal possessions and had sort of a group communalism. It said that they would wear their clothes until they wore them out. And it was interesting when they did the archeology around the Qumran community. One of the things they found a lot of were the tiny nails that would go into the sandals. And you think, well, it's odd that they would find so many of them, because they would wear the sandals out until there was almost nothing holding them together. They were very involved in ritual purification. Of course, all the Jews practiced ritual purification, but the Essenes, again, went just a bit above and beyond in these practices. And they copied the scriptures, especially this group that was in Qumran. And because of that, they have left to us what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let's look at that Qumran community. It's on the shores of the Dead Sea, on the very northwestern corner of the Dead Sea, about 18 miles from Jerusalem as the crow flies. But if you're not a crow, then you're going to have to make a bit of a detour, because you can't get there in a straight line. You actually have to go to the north and follow the road down past Jericho, and then move south as you come to Qumran. You're there by the shores of the Dead Sea. This is the lowest spot on the face of the earth. And there on a little bit of a plateau, notice on the right, that looks a little bit of a plateau, and then behind that, you actually have, it looks like mountains, but actually it's the edge of the valley, and it just continues going up higher and higher, because by the shores of the Dead Sea, you're 1,400 feet below sea level. And so you have to go up considerable distance just to get even with sea level on your way all the way up to Jerusalem. Notice there's no clear path going up to Jerusalem in the direction you're looking. Here we're looking at Cave 4 of Qumran. There were a number of different caves that had scrolls in them. This seems to have been an artificial cave where it was cut out from the rock, and scrolls were placed in it. And now we're looking at the community itself. It had a number of small rooms and then large rooms that they felt that might have served either as a dining room or as a scriptorium, where copies would be made, both of the scriptures as well as other Jewish writings, as well as what we could call the sectarian writings of the Qumran community itself. Here is a water channel bringing water to one of those ritual baths. We'll look at the bath itself, the mikvah, and notice the steps going steps going down into it, and you would go in and you would immerse yourself and then come out and you would be now ceremonially clean. Here's an artist's conception, compliments of National Geographic magazine, showing what that would have looked like. And here's an aerial view of that Qumran community. Now, notice I said that you have rooms for storage, rooms for the scriptorium for writing the scriptures, rooms perhaps for eating. None of these are bunk rooms. None of these are places where people would sleep. Instead, it was the practice of the Essenes to go out and sleep in one of the caves that lined the cliffs. And so they would walk to the cave, sleep there, and then come here for their congregation, for their ritual baths, for their copying of the scriptures, perhaps for their prayers together. There's an artist's conception of what that might have looked like in the first century. As I said, the Qumran caves, and not only did these caves provide a place for and you can see a few of them even from here, they provided a place for the community to sleep at night, but also these became the hiding places of the scriptures, and they would take the scriptures and in some cases place them in jars and then hide them in the caves, and that led to their preservation. Here we are 2,000 years later finding these scrolls, and they were preserved for us. Now that community was finally interrupted in 70 AD. A revolt had broken out in the year 66 AD, where the Jews declared themselves independent. A legion was sent down from Syria to quell the revolt, and the 12th Legion, Roman legion, was defeated by the Jews, and they thought, oh goodness, look, we've won our independence. Well, that independence would be very short-lived, as Vespasian, a grizzled old general, was sent in command not of one, but of 3 legions, and he sent his son Titus to collect a 4th from Egypt, and they landed in Galilee, and first subjugating Galilee, and there one of their captives was a Jewish general named Josephus, who, upon being captured, offered his allegiance to the Romans and became both an eyewitness and a scribe, recording as an eyewitness testimony the rest of the war and the fall of Jerusalem. Josephus writes a number of writings, The Wars of the Jews, also a book called The Antiquities, detailing the history of the Jews, and some other writings as well. Now, Vespasian, while he was in Galilee, Rome had seen the death of the Emperor Nero, and what followed in the year 69 is commonly called the Year of the 4 Emperors, where one and then another person and then a third each tried to become emperor, and none of them lasted for more than about 3 or 4 months. And finally, Vespasian said, well, I can do a better job than all of them. And he left his son Titus in charge of finishing up the capture of Jerusalem, and he went away to Rome to become the emperor, and in his case, he made it stick. He becomes the emperor until his death quite a number of years later. And this leaves Titus to capture Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. Titus first encircled the city with a wall all the way around the city, nobody going in, nobody going out. And then bit by bit broke through each wall. The last part of the temple or the last part of the city to be captured was the temple, as they broke through the Fortress Antonia on the right of our picture, and then from there were able to gain entrance down into the temple, captured the temple, and in the fighting, the temple was burnt to the ground. The temple was completely destroyed. So you have Titus capturing it. After a siege, he conquered Jerusalem in August of 70 AD. On the same day of the year, the 9th of Av, that the temple had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar some 600 plus years earlier. And so ended the temple worship, the temple sacrifices. They all came to a close now. You can go not and see the temple up on the Temple Mount. There's no trace of it almost left, but you can see the stones from the surrounding wall still standing there. And of course, Jesus had prophesied this. Jesus had actually told his disciples, Luke 21, verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. And the Christians who remembered that prophecy had all left town. They had all evacuated not just Jerusalem, but the whole land of Israel, and they had moved out of Israel, and so they were delivered, leaving the other Jewish people there in Jerusalem to suffer their fate. Here's a coin, blow up of a coin, depicting and celebrating the fall of Jerusalem. Notice you have depicted a woman. She represents the Jews, and what it says is Judea capta, in other words, captive Jerusalem, captive Judea. And she has been captured and taken by this strong man behind her. Reminds us a little bit of the vision that John describes in the book of Revelation of a woman who has been taken and treated very poorly. And it turns out that she has, she's being requited. She is being returned for the sins that she has taken in persecuting God's people, the church. When you go to Rome, you can see the Arch of Titus. It's a large structure, and notice on the inside of that arch, you have depicted upon the one side, the Romans, they're carrying those spoils from the temple, including the great menorah, the lampstand, as they're bringing it back, and amidst their victory, they're bringing back all of these riches. On the other side of the arch, you have Titus himself pictured riding the chariot and entering the city in victory as he is given the honor of a royal triumph. And in these scenes, we see pictured that triumph as the spoils that had been taken from the city, leading the emperor upon his chariot with the steeds, the riches that they had captured from Jerusalem now become part of the Roman treasury. And legend has it that behind the victorious general would be a slave holding the wreath over his head and whispering in his ear, "Remember, you are only human." The spoils that were used from the fall of Jerusalem, the riches that were taken, were used to build the great Colosseum of Rome, which still stands as a reminder of the riches that were once part of the temple.